Rain had fallen over Ashbourne Manor since dawn, turning the gravel paths silver and blurring the distant hills beneath mist. Inside, everything was warm and ordered. Servants hurried through corridors carrying tea, flowers, and linens, while Lady Eleanor Whitmore sat before the fire examining a diamond necklace belonging to her future husband. In 6 weeks, Eleanor was supposed to become a duchess. The thought should have filled Duke Edward Ashbourne with happiness. Instead, watching her from the doorway, he felt an unfamiliar uneasiness. Edward was 35, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair falling in gentle waves and a few silver strands at his temples. His short beard gave his handsome face a seriousness that London society often mistook for arrogance. He possessed an ancient title, vast estates, political influence, and a fortune large enough to support generations. Yet lately, he had begun to wonder whether anyone truly desired Edward himself. Eleanor was beautiful. She had pale skin, elegant features, and the refined manners expected of a woman raised among England's aristocracy. Their engagement had been celebrated throughout London. Newspapers praised the union. Her mother called it an alliance of distinguished families, and Edward's relatives assured him he had chosen wisely. Yet love seemed strangely absent. Edward had once believed he loved Eleanor. Perhaps he still did. What troubled him was the suspicion that she loved something else more deeply: his title, his fortune, his name. 3 weeks earlier, Edward had returned from London and found Eleanor speaking with her cousin in the library. They stopped talking the instant he entered. Another evening, he noticed Eleanor asking his steward detailed questions about the Ashbourne properties. She laughed when Edward mentioned it, claiming a future duchess ought to understand the household she would manage. Perhaps she was innocent. Perhaps Edward was suspicious without reason. But there had been other moments, small moments. A look exchanged between Eleanor and her mother when Edward mentioned revising his will. A conversation that abruptly ended when he approached. A letter Eleanor had hidden beneath a book before allowing him into her sitting room. Edward could have confronted her. Instead, he would become invisible. That evening, after the household had gone quiet, Edward summoned his trusted butler, Mr. Hawthorne, to his private study. "I need your help," Edward said. The older man stared at him. "Your Grace, whenever you say those words, I fear the consequences. I intend to discover what my fiancée says when she believes I cannot hear her." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "You suspect Lady Eleanor?" "I suspect everyone who praises me too eagerly." Edward explained his plan. He would return disguised as a newly hired servant. His clothes would be plain, his hair altered, his posture changed, and his speech softened. He would use the name Thomas and perform ordinary household duties. Hawthorne objected. "If anyone recognizes you, they will not. And if Lady Eleanor discovers the deception, I will deal with it when the time comes." The butler studied his master for a long moment before reluctantly agreeing. The transformation was astonishing. The following morning, Edward stood before his mirror wearing a charcoal waistcoat, worn trousers, and a plain white shirt. His signet ring was gone, his polished boots replaced by scuffed servant shoes. His hair was brushed differently, and artificial shadow made his beard appear rougher. He no longer looked like a duke. He looked like a laborer. At breakfast, Eleanor barely glanced at him. "Thomas," Hawthorne announced, "you will assist in the East Wing." Edward bowed his head. "As you wish, my lady." Eleanor smiled politely and returned to her tea. That single moment told Edward more than he expected. She had looked directly at him without seeing him. For the first time in years, Edward understood what it meant to possess no title at all. He spent the morning carrying linens, polishing silver, and delivering messages. The work was unfamiliar, but strangely grounding. Servants spoke freely around him because they believed he was one of them. Their conversations revealed details the Duke had never heard while sitting at the head of the dinner table. By afternoon, Edward learned Eleanor had been asking about investments. By evening, he learned her mother was discussing the wedding settlement with unusual urgency. But the most important discovery came in the West Corridor. There, Edward met Clara Bennet. She was 24 and worked as Eleanor's personal seamstress. Her dress was modest and faded from years of use, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple cap, and her intelligent brown eyes seemed to notice everything. Edward had dropped a stack of folded cloth. Before he could gather it, Clara knelt beside him. "Allow me. I can manage," he said. "I am sure you can," she replied with a faint smile. "But there is no shame in accepting help." Edward looked at her. No one in London had spoken to him that way. Not as a duke. Not as an obligation. Simply as a man. "Thank you," he murmured. Clara gathered the cloth. "You are new here, Thomas?" "Yes." "Then be careful. Beautiful houses can hide ugly things." She walked away before he could ask what she meant. That night, Edward remained awake long after midnight. He thought about Eleanor, Clara, and the warning hidden inside Clara's words. The next morning, he followed Eleanor from the drawing room. She entered a small sitting room with her cousin, Lady Margaret. Edward stopped outside the half-open door. Then he heard Eleanor speak. "I will not marry him for love." Edward froze. His hand tightened around the silver tray he carried. Inside, Eleanor continued quietly. "I will marry the Duke because once I become his wife, everything he possesses will eventually be mine." Edward's world seemed to go silent. For the first time, he understood that the woman he intended to marry might never have loved him at all. Edward remained motionless outside the sitting room, the silver tray trembling in his hands. Eleanor's voice continued through the narrow opening, and every word struck him with the force of a blade. "I will not marry him for love," she said. Edward froze. "I will marry the Duke because once I become his wife, everything he possesses will eventually be mine." Lady Margaret gave a nervous laugh. "But what if the Duke discovers your intentions?" "He will not. Edward sees what he wishes to see. He thinks affection can be purchased with smiles." Edward stepped away before either woman could see him. Only yesterday, he had wondered whether his suspicions were unfair. Now there was no uncertainty. "I have waited too long for this opportunity," Eleanor continued. "Once the marriage is completed, the Ashbourne fortune will secure my family forever." "And the estate?" Margaret asked. "After the wedding, I shall persuade him to place several properties under my management. My brother's company can handle his investments. In a few years, Ashbourne will depend upon the Whitmores." Edward felt cold. This was not merely a loveless marriage. It was a carefully designed theft. He returned to the servants' corridor and forced himself to breathe normally. For the rest of the day, he worked as though nothing had happened. Inside, however, something precious had died. Edward had loved Eleanor because he believed she understood the lonely man beneath the title. Now he wondered whether every tender moment had been calculated. That afternoon, he found Clara working beside the conservatory. Rolls of silk covered the table, surrounded by needles, ribbons, and unfinished gowns. She looked up. "You seem troubled, Thomas." "I am merely tired." Clara studied him. "You look wounded." He had no answer. She returned to her sewing. "You need not tell me anything." That kindness unsettled him more than questions would have. "Why are you kind to everyone?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "I am not. You were kind to me because you dropped the cloth." Edward laughed quietly. "And that deserves kindness?" "Perhaps not. But why should it deserve cruelty?" Her answer stayed with him. Over the next several days, Edward noticed how differently Clara was treated. Eleanor summoned her without warning, demanded alterations at impossible hours, and criticized dresses Clara had spent nights creating. One evening, Edward watched Eleanor throw a finished gown onto the floor. "The embroidery is uneven." Clara immediately knelt. "I can correct it, my lady. You always have an excuse." "I have no excuse. I will repair it." Eleanor glanced at Edward. "Thomas, take those things to the servants' quarters." Edward obeyed, but his anger burned. Later, he found Clara repairing the damaged embroidery alone. "You should not let her speak to you like that," he said. Clara smiled sadly. "She is my employer. That does not make humiliation acceptable. You speak as though people are treated according to what they deserve." Edward looked at her. "Are they not?" "No. Sometimes people are treated according to what others believe they are worth." The words struck him deeply. She had no idea that the man beside her was one of England's most powerful nobles. That night, Edward discovered another letter. It had been delivered to Eleanor, but had fallen behind a cabinet. The seal belonged to her brother. Edward opened it. The letter confirmed everything. Eleanor's brother had already arranged loans based on the expectation of her marriage. He planned to use Edward's future wealth as security. Edward read it twice. His heart hardened. The next morning, he decided to investigate further before ending the engagement. If he confronted Eleanor immediately, she could destroy the evidence and twist the story against him. His investigation led to an unexpected discovery. Eleanor had been meeting a solicitor in secret. Edward followed her at a distance and listened from behind a garden wall. The marriage settlement must be signed before the Duke becomes suspicious, the solicitor said. He will sign, Eleanor answered. And if he does not? Eleanor laughed. Then I shall make certain society believes he abandoned me without cause. A duke who humiliates his fiancée will lose London sympathy. Edward's jaw tightened. She had planned even his reputation. Then Eleanor mentioned Clara. That seamstress has become a nuisance. She notices too much. I want her dismissed after the wedding. The solicitor agreed. Edward felt anger rise within him. Clara had done nothing except work honestly and treat people with kindness. He returned to Ashbourne Manor before Eleanor noticed his absence. That evening, Clara approached him in the servants' hall. Thomas. Yes. I heard Lady Eleanor intends to dismiss me. Edward looked at her. Did she tell you? No, but I know how these things happen. Clara folded her hands nervously. I have nowhere else to go. My mother depends upon my wages. Edward felt an ache in his chest. I will not let you be abandoned. She looked at him with surprise. You cannot promise that. I can promise I will try. Clara smiled. That is a dangerous promise. Why? People make promises when they have power. Then they forget them when the promise becomes inconvenient. Edward lowered his eyes. For the first time, he understood that Clara's distrust was not bitterness. I will remember, he said. Neither knew how much those words would change their lives. That night, Edward stood utterly alone beneath the manor's great grand staircase. He had entered the household believing he would discover whether his fiancée was unfaithful. Instead, he had discovered something worse. Eleanor intended to marry him for his fortune, exploit his estate, destroy his reputation if necessary, and remove the one innocent person who had shown him genuine kindness. But Edward still possessed one advantage. Eleanor believed Thomas was merely a servant. She had no idea that the man she was plotting against had been listening to every word. He would not expose himself yet, not until the truth was impossible to deny, not until he could protect Clara. The following morning, Edward woke before sunrise, having barely slept. He stood before the mirror in his servant's clothes and stared at the stranger reflected there. The disguise had begun as a means of discovering betrayal. Now it had become the only way to uncover Eleanor's plans. For 3 days, Edward gathered information. He discovered that Eleanor's brother owed considerable debts to London lenders. He learned that several creditors expected repayment after Eleanor became Duchess. He also discovered that the solicitor had prepared documents granting Eleanor authority over portions of Edward's estate. Eleanor intended to persuade Edward to change his will shortly after their marriage. He had once imagined growing old beside Eleanor, watching children play across Ashbourne Gardens. Now those dreams seemed like memories belonging to another man. Yet Clara remained in his thoughts. She had never asked about his wealth. She had never treated him differently from the other servants. She spoke gently to the kitchen maid, defended an elderly footman, and quietly repaired clothing for servants who could not afford new garments. One afternoon, Edward found her sitting beneath an oak tree behind the estate chapel. You should be working, he said. So should you. I finished early. So did I. Edward sat several feet away. Then Clara said, Are you truly a servant? Edward's heart stopped. What makes you ask? You carry yourself differently. How? Like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Edward forced a smile. Perhaps I am simply confident. Perhaps. She looked toward the distant hills. I once knew a wealthy gentleman who treated everyone beneath him terribly. Since then, I have learned that confidence and arrogance often wear the same coat." Edward laughed softly. "Do you dislike wealthy gentlemen?" "I dislike cruel people." "And kind wealthy gentlemen?" "If such men exist, I suppose I would not dislike them." He wanted desperately to tell her everything. He asked, what if someone lied about who he was? Clara became thoughtful. "Then I would ask why. And if his reason was fear, fear explains a lie. It does not erase it." Her answer stayed with him. That evening, Edward decided he could no longer continue the deception with Clara. He waited until the household slept, then asked her to meet him in the old library. Clara arrived cautiously. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because there is something you must know." He removed his servant's coat. Then he reached beneath his collar and pulled out the hidden chain bearing the Ashbourne crest. Clara stared. Her face went pale. "You are—" "Yes." "The Duke." Edward nodded. "No. I am sorry. You lied to me." "I did. Every conversation, not my feelings." She shook her head. "You expect me to believe that?" Edward told her everything. He explained his suspicions, his disguise, the conversations he had overheard, Eleanor's plans, and the documents he had discovered. When he finished, tears filled her eyes. "You should have told me." "I know. Why did you trust me enough to reveal everything now?" "Because I realized I could not ask you to trust me while continuing to hide behind another name." Clara turned away. "I am only a seamstress. That has never mattered to me. It matters to everyone else. It does not matter to me." She looked back at him. "You are a duke. I am nobody. You are the first person in years who spoke to me without caring what I owned." Clara left without giving him an answer. The next morning, Edward ended his engagement. Lady Eleanor appeared before society in mourning colors, claiming the Duke had suddenly become cold and unreasonable. Her mother suggested Edward had suffered some private crisis. Until the solicitor arrived. At a private meeting, Edward placed the letters and documents upon the table. Eleanor's expression changed. "You cannot do this." "I can. You promised to marry me." "I promised because I believed you loved me." She stared at him. "You spied on me?" "I discovered the truth." Her anger erupted. "You humiliated me." Edward's voice remained calm. "You intended to ruin me." "I intended to protect my family." "You intended to use me." Silence followed. Edward did not shout. He did not insult her. He simply ended the engagement. Within days, the evidence reached Eleanor's family. The arrangement collapsed. Eleanor's reputation suffered, though Edward refused to encourage gossip beyond the facts. But Clara was gone. She had left Ashbourne Manor the morning after the engagement ended. Edward found her empty sewing room and stood there for a long time. A small wooden box remained on the table. Inside was a folded handkerchief he had once dropped while working. Clara had repaired its torn corner. Edward held it carefully. He understood then that ending his engagement had not solved his greatest problem. He had lost the woman who had taught him what genuine kindness looked like. He knew that wealth could command obedience, but it could never command the affection he had once mistaken for love. Edward rejected every proposal brought by his family. His mother was furious. "You cannot remain unmarried forever." "I can remain unmarried rather than marry without love." "You are a duke. You have responsibilities." "I know. Then choose an appropriate woman." Edward looked toward the window. "I already did." Meanwhile, Clara returned to her mother's modest home and resumed sewing for local families. She tried to forget the Duke, but forgetting him proved impossible. She remembered the servant who had listened to her troubles, laughed at her jokes, and promised to remember. Then she remembered that the servant had never truly existed. One rainy evening, a carriage stopped outside her house. A footman delivered a letter. Clara recognized the seal. Edward had written only a few lines. He did not ask her to return. He did not command her. He simply asked her to meet him once, as herself, while he stood before her as himself. Clara read the letter twice. Then she looked toward the rain-darkened road. For the first time since leaving Ashbourne Manor, she wondered whether their story truly had to end. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the countryside washed clean beneath a pale spring sky. Clara stood before her small bedroom mirror, holding Edward's letter in trembling hands. She had read it so many times that the paper had softened at the folds. He had not ordered her to return. He had not promised wealth, jewels, or a grand title. He had simply asked to see her, as himself. That distinction mattered. By noon, Clara arrived at Ashbourne Manor. The great house looked exactly as she remembered, yet somehow different. Perhaps it was because she no longer entered as a seamstress waiting to be summoned. She had been invited. Edward waited in the library. He wore no ceremonial coat, only a dark tailored suit. His expression was serious, but when he saw Clara, something in his face softened. "Thank you for coming. I nearly did not. I understand." Clara remained near the door. "You hurt me. I know. You made me believe I was speaking to a servant named Thomas. I know. You allowed me to care for you, without knowing who you were." Edward lowered his eyes. That was wrong. Clara had expected excuses. Instead, his honesty disarmed her. "I cannot change what I did," he continued. "I can only promise never to hide behind another identity again." She looked at him carefully. "And what do you want from me?" "The truth." "That is a dangerous thing to ask." "It is the only thing I want." Edward stepped closer, but stopped several feet away. "I loved Eleanor because I believed she loved me. When I discovered her intentions, I thought betrayal was the worst thing I could endure. Then you left, and I understood that losing you was worse." Clara swallowed. "You are a duke." "Yes." "I am a seamstress." "Yes." "Your family will object." "They already have." "And society?" "They will gossip." She almost smiled. "You make it sound simple." "It will not be simple." For the first time, Edward looked vulnerable. "But I would rather face every insult in England beside you than spend one peaceful day with someone who loves my title instead of me." Clara looked away. She had dreamed of hearing such words, but dreams were safer than reality. "What happens when the excitement fades?" she asked. "When London ladies laugh because your Duchess once repaired sleeves for a living. Then I will remind them that the woman they mock is the woman who taught me what loyalty means." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Edward did not touch her. He waited. That patience finally broke the wall she had built around herself. "I loved Thomas," she whispered. Edward's expression softened. "And I love Edward," she continued. "But I need to know they're the same man." "They are." "Then prove it." "How?" "Do not rescue me because you pity me. Do not marry me because you feel guilty. Let me remain myself." Edward nodded. "I would never ask you to become anyone else." Weeks passed. Edward refused to rush Clara. Instead, he visited her mother's home openly, without disguises or secrets. He sat at their modest table, drank tea from chipped porcelain, and listened to Clara describe her work. His mother objected fiercely. "A seamstress cannot become Duchess of Ashbourne." Edward answered calmly, "A title does not determine a person's worth." His relatives warned him about scandal. He listened respectfully, then made his decision. The wedding was held in early summer. London society expected an aristocratic spectacle, but Edward chose something simpler. Clara wore an ivory gown of her own design, decorated with delicate embroidery. She refused an enormous crown and accepted only a modest family tiara. When she walked into the chapel, Edward forgot the watching nobles. He saw only the woman who had once knelt beside a servant to gather fallen cloth. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Clara looked at Edward with tears in her eyes. She smiled warmly. Their marriage caused endless conversation throughout London. Some called Clara unsuitable. Others called Edward reckless. But Edward and Clara continued their life together despite every whisper. One evening, Edward and Clara walked through the same garden where he had once secretly followed Eleanor. The roses were blooming. Clara paused beside the old oak. "This is where you first asked me about wealthy gentlemen." Edward laughed. "And you said you disliked cruel people." "I still do. Fortunately, I am not cruel." She raised an eyebrow. "You once disguised yourself as a servant and secretly followed your fiancée. That was questionable judgment. Very questionable." They laughed together. Edward looked across the gardens. "Do you ever regret marrying me?" Clara considered the question. "Sometimes." He stared at her in mock horror. She smiled. "Only when you leave your books everywhere." Edward laughed. Then Clara took his hand. "But never the man I married." He kissed her forehead. Years later, when people told the story of the Duke, who became a servant to investigate his fiancée, they remembered the scandal. They remembered Eleanor's betrayal. But Edward and Clara remembered something else. He had entered the servants' quarters, believing he was searching for proof that his fiancée was unfaithful. Instead, he discovered that wealth could attract affection without creating love. He discovered that a title could command respect without earning loyalty. And most importantly, he discovered that the woman who treated him kindly when she believed he possessed nothing was the woman worthy of everything he had. Clara had once feared that becoming Duchess would erase the woman she was. Edward proved otherwise. She remained a seamstress at heart, creating beauty with her hands, noticing those whom society ignored, and remembering that dignity did not belong only to the wealthy. And Edward remained the Duke, but he was no longer merely a man surrounded by servants. He had become a husband, a friend, and a man humbled by love. Their story began with a disguise. It ended with complete honesty. And in the end, the Duke did not lose a Duchess. He found a wife,